Well, good morning, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Leslie Maitland, chair of the Amram Scholar Series, and as Rabbi Lustig could not be here, I'm honored to introduce today's dynamic speaker, Tal Keinan. He is, among other things, the author of God is in the Crowd, 21st Century Judaism, which Britain's Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks has described as enthralling, searching, profound, an extraordinarily powerful work on Jewish identity, and I can vouch for that. Last Tuesday evening, in case you missed it, 3 Israeli couples stood in our sanctuary, each under the ritual shelter of their own chuppah erected on our bima, to be married by American rabbis, including Rabbi Lustig. They had journeyed here because Israeli law does not permit civil marriage and only recognizes religious marriages performed under the strict requirements of the Orthodox rabbinate. Each for different reasons, these couples, among them one who were gay, did not qualify, raising once again the question of what it takes to be considered truly Jewish in Israel. And how does the answer to that question affect us, Jews in the diaspora, both in our feelings for Israel and in our ability or commitment to identify meaningfully as Jews? Tal Keinan grappled with that same issue 20 years ago when he and his American bride, eager to be wed in Jerusalem, learned a Reform rabbi could not marry them in Israel. In what he viewed as an absurdity of Jewish governance, they were first obliged to go through a perfunctory civil service in the office of the New York City clerk. That was not the first time, however, that Tal had struggled with questions of identity. Was he a secular Jewish American or a religious American Jew? As a child in Miami, he wanted to exchange his given name of Tal, which means dew, D-E-W in Hebrew, for the more familiar name of Scott. Yet as a young man in Israel, where he chose to become a citizen after having graduated from the prestigious New England prep school, Phillips Exeter Academy, he would trade his family's European name of Wiener for the Israeli name of Keinan as his own private badge of belonging to Israel. When a few non-Israeli born people to serve in the elite Israeli Air Force, he graduated from its academy and rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel in its reserves. I have to tell you that Tal is undoubtedly also the very first Amram scholar ever to fly himself to Washington on his own plane to speak in our lecture series, as he did this morning with his daughter Ella. He graduated from Tel Aviv University and went on to earn a master's degree at the Harvard Business School. A self-described insider in two worlds, he joined the private equity firm in Israel and then went on to found Clarity Capital, a global asset management firm with offices in New York and Tel Aviv. As CEO, he has lived with his family alternately in both places. He is chairman of Koret Israel Economic Development Funds, Israel's largest nonprofit lender to small and micro businesses. He serves on the board of the Steinhardt Foundation for Jewish Life, and he is a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. With this most impressive background, Tal says he began to worry that while Jewish individuals have become safe in America and in Israel, their communities have weakened. Increasingly, he has grown alarmed that the challenges of modernity will end Jewish history, and with it the distinctive contribution of the Jews to human history. His book interweaves an engrossing personal story with a provocative attempt to confront existing threats to Jewish survival and to chart a path into the future. Now, please do take a moment to silence your cell phones as I present Tal Keinan. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to use this one if that's all right. I don't know if that means we need to shut this off. All right. Thank you, Leslie, and thank you, everybody, for inviting me and for coming. Judaism is a concept in constant evolution. I don't think there's been a generation of Jews in history who bequeathed the same Judaism to their children as the Judaism they inherited from their parents. But we can think of the Jewish story as having experienced two fundamental reinventions, not evolutions, but revolutions, in our identity, in the way we perceive of ourselves, and the way we govern ourselves. The first is the Exodus. As a people in Egypt, it's unclear exactly what makes us a people, unclear to me at least. Unclear what delineates us or distinguishes us from other people. We're not the only slaves in Egypt. And 40 years later, we are a sovereign in our own land, governed by a book of law that has stayed with us to this day. It's a fundamental reinvention of the entire enterprise of Judaism. The second is the expulsion from Israel under the Roman Empire. Not the Babylonian expulsion. I don't think that qualifies, but the Roman expulsion does, in that it almost permanently, or certainly for 2,000 years, ends Jewish sovereignty. We conceive of ourselves until that point in a way that's kind of similar to most of the people around us, in that we are attached to a land and we are ruled by a hierarchy. The Phoenicians don't look very different. Yes, we have the Torah, we have a few other things. They also have their own special attributes. But we're structured pretty much like everybody else. In fact, there is no people at that point that is not attached to a geography. And from that point, get dispersed across hundreds of different nodes around the world. Most of those nodes are not coordinated with others, right? A Jewish community in Casablanca is not speaking to a Jewish community in Lodz. Most of them are not even aware of each other. In fact, that was probably a good example of two communities that were not even aware of each other for most of the next 1,800 years. At the time of the expulsion, we already live under a very complex orthodoxy, which is going to become much more complex over the centuries. It's going to evolve dramatically, and there's nobody coordinating that evolution. There's no pope, no global leader of the Jews who's officiating over exactly how we evolve. Had I been asked to bet how long this was going to last, how long there would be a coherent identity in the world called Jew, I would have given it maybe 2 generations. I think that would have been about it. I definitely would have bet against the idea that 1,800 years later there would still be a coherent identity called Jew. A very different identity than it was in the year 135. Very different, but coherent. And here we are. I argue that we are on the eve of a third fundamental reinvention of Judaism. And on the one hand, I think that presents an amazing opportunity, an opportunity that we haven't had in about 2,000 years. On the other hand, if we are not successful at that reinvention, I think we're looking at the end of our civilization. This is the end of the Jewish story, if we're not successful in doing that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we would define ourselves. But in order to get there, I think it's important to start with a bad definition. And one of the kind of essential proverbs of the Israeli Air Force is a bad plan is better than no plan. So I'm going to start with a bad plan, and then we're going to amend it as we go. And that begins with my own original definition of Judaism. What made me a Jew? Which I've come to see as absolutely wrong. This is not how it works, or not how it can work going forward. So as a kid in boarding school who was not very Jewishly affiliated, came from a Jewish home, I think I would have said I was proud of my Judaism, but had you asked me what exactly about your Judaism are you proud about, I really wouldn't have had an answer. I didn't know anything really about a vague sense of Jewish history. That's about it. But I saw the picture of the boy in the Warsaw Ghetto with his hands up in surrender to Nazi troops. I'm guessing almost everybody is familiar with the picture, very iconic picture from the war. If you're not, just Google boy in the Warsaw Ghetto. It's the first image that comes up in Google. And I was very moved by the picture, but from a way that struck me as the wrong way, in that if you can picture it, the boy is in the center of the picture. The Nazi soldiers are on the right side of the picture, their guns pointed in his direction, and it's framed in a way that really begs this juxtaposition of his innocence, he was maybe 6 or 7 years old, and the brutality of the Nazis. They're heavily armed and they're pointing their guns at a kid. That tension never spoke to me. I understood it was supposed to, but it didn't. And I looked in the faces of the Nazis, which are very clear in the picture, And I couldn't muster hatred or even anger. They just looked irrelevant. They were just that generation's manifestation of a phenomenon that has been plaguing our people for centuries. There's nothing new here. They switch uniforms all the time, but it's the same phenomenon. I knew enough about our story to recognize that. But if you pan over to the left side of the picture, and if you Google it and you want to look at this, make sure you're looking at the full picture, because sometimes they zoom in on exactly that framing. You've got to see the picture that shows the boy's family and probably his neighbors. They're on the left side of the frame. And if you look, you see they're coming out of the exit of a residential building in the ghetto. This is the final liquidation of the ghetto in 1943. And they're also in this state. Their hands are up. They're in this state of shocked submission. And that's what got me in that picture. I was angry. I was furious at them for abrogating what I considered to be their most fundamental duty, which was the physical protection of this child. They're the Jews. The Jews are supposed to have a plan B. And these people, it seemed to me, had somehow convinced themselves that they were Polish. No different from their neighbors. And when the time came, their neighbors would rally to their support. And of course, that's not what happened. And as far as I know, everybody in that picture was dead within a few weeks, maybe even a few days. It took me a few weeks to realize that I'm probably as close in age to that boy's parents as I was to the boy at the time. And I didn't have a plan B. Here I am only really having conceived of myself as American. Jewish was a very incidental identity for me, right? I'm also right-handed. It doesn't really mean anything to me. It's a fact, but it's not an interesting one. Was I guilty of the same complacency that these people had been guilty of? The question crystallized in my mind, and it's an American question: is this a unique phenomenon in Jewish history, America, or is this just what it feels like at the ascendant phase of any cycle in Judaism? My German grandfather would have argued that he felt just as German as I feel American. I imagine had we had ancestors in Spain in the 14th century, they would have said the same thing. How can you know? So I still don't have a definitive answer. I will say I'm going to jump ahead. If I had a gun to my head now and I had to answer, I think I'd say yes. I think this is a special phenomenon in Jewish history. If I had to bet, I would bet that it is. But I don't know, and I don't think any of us really knows. But what was interesting to me at the time is that nobody else wanted to talk about this question. There were other Jewish kids at Exeter. This was not a discussion topic that people would engage in. My parents didn't want to talk about it. No, this was just not. Who thinks about these things? I'd been spending time in Israel and on a summer tour of a program that's sort of a precursor to Birthright. A coin dropped for me. And I looked, and I'd been, very consumed with this question, and feeling very original and kind of subversive in my little, dorm room in New Hampshire, questioning Jewish history. And I looked around, and I saw a whole society that not only was unafraid to engage with that question, they had answered it, and they answered it with their feet. They weren't sitting in a dorm room. They were out tilling fields and defending those fields. They had reclaimed Jewish sovereignty. And I fell in love. I think that's the best way to describe it. I had known Israel at that point, but not like this. This was me being really swept off my feet. And in retrospect, I think what I saw in these people who had committed to Jewish agency and Jewish sovereignty, and who were willing to pay a very high price for that, eyes wide open. Everybody understood the price and was still there. Willing to pay it, is I discovered Jewish dignity. And I look back at that picture now, and I realize that that's what really grabbed me in that picture, is the total lack of dignity. We're just victims, no agency. So I'm swept off my feet. I take a college year abroad as an opportunity to live in Israel. find it works. My Hebrew is decent. I'm making friends, and decide I'm going to stay. And through a kind of succession of sort of comic errors, end up at the Air Force Academy in Israel. And I think the interesting thing to consider at this point is I've pretty much described to you my whole conception of Judaism at age 19. That's about it. I don't know Torah. I don't know, I really don't know much about Israel either. I don't really know Israel's history. I don't know Jewish history. I don't know what Israeli society is like. And I enter this very focused, very intense environment at the academy. And it turns out I'm pretty good at it, and they keep me on. And you can't really lose focus. It's such an intense environment. This is all I'm really focused on, is surviving at the academy. I graduate. I end up in a fighter squadron, no less intense. It's a very, your training doesn't end at that point, so you're still very focused on that. And when your training does formally end, you're now in combat, and that's no less an intense pursuit, particularly in Israel in the 1990s. So years go by, and I never really get a chance to zoom out and examine, what am I doing here exactly? I want to remember, yes, I fell in love, I remember that, got swept off my feet, dignity, yeah. What exactly is this about? And toward the end of my active service, I continued in reserves afterwards, but toward the end of my active service, when I start thinking, what do I want to do next? I'm in my late 20s, I'm looking around and realizing I don't know Israelis. I really don't know Israel. I know a very, very narrow segment of Israeli society that is unrepresentative in pretty much every way you can imagine. I've never spent time in Dimona or in Kiryat Shmona. I barely really spent time in Tel Aviv. I don't know people outside of this community. I definitely don't know Judaism. I'm increasingly becoming convinced that America is that home, the question that we started with. Because when I fly back to visit my family, I have 3 older brothers, all married to non-Jewish women, and I have non-Jewish nieces and nephews, and I love them, and we're close, and they're American. They're American. One of them is about to have children himself, and his children will be really full-on American. They don't identify as Jewish, doesn't keep us from being very close. Maybe this is really a home for us. In fact, if I try to think back of the examples in history where we could do this at the rate that we're doing it now, I'm not sure I can find any. Yes, there's been a Jewish apostasy for 1,800 years. We have melded into societies. Never at anything approaching this rate, and never for such an extended period of time. Right? The windows that opened up to apostasy were always very short. This one has not been. Which raises the question, why did I do this exactly? Right? What started off kind of as a Peace Corps or Teach for America moment ended up becoming much more involved in that. And maybe more importantly, I had already taken action that was irreversible many times. There's no way to take that back. Can't just walk away, fly back to the United States and move on, go to law school or something. So I knew I was in and couldn't get out, and I needed to understand exactly why. And this book really starts at a moment of crisis for me. Well, the book doesn't start at that moment, but the writing of the book starts at that moment of crisis, where I realized I need to dig very deep and understand, first of all, what is Israel? What is this exactly? And what is Judaism? Which I think is the fundamental question that we need to ask today. Because here's what's changed in our architecture. 90% of world Jewry is now in the United States and Israel. The word diaspora is no longer a useful term or a useful model for just describing our physical architecture in the world. These 2 jurisdictions, I will argue, and when there are comments, I'm almost sure somebody will take an opposing view, and I welcome it. These are 2 patently philo-Semitic jurisdictions. Right? There's never been an anti-Jewish law on the books here in this country. I would argue that this country started with a very philo-Semitic ideal, and I get into a little bit in the book at how the framers of our Constitution saw Judaism. And I would say that to this day, I've never encountered anti-Semitism in this country. I know it exists. I know it exists. Guess what? It exists in Israel too. It's at the fringes. It's something that most of us can afford to ignore. Most of us do ignore. And we live our lives completely devoid of anti-Semitism in a way that my wife's French family never could. Right? My wife's family's been in France since as long as they can remember. It's an old Ashkenazi French Jewish family. To this day, they talk about the French. And they're not talking about themselves when they say that. They're Jews. The French is everybody else. That's not America. We are truly Americans here. And of course, in Israel, we're Israelis. And we live a life of safety in both of these countries. We live a life of prosperity. In fact, I don't know if there's ever been a better time, not in 2,000 years, in 4,000 years, for the individual Jew. This is probably peak Jew right now. But as a community, we are encountering a challenge that I don't think we've ever encountered before, in that 90% of us have the option of not being Jewish. I was going to say we can opt out, but increasingly I think we need to opt in this country, and we're not. We're not opting in. So I'm going to get dark for a minute, but I promise that we're going to end this on an optimistic note or a prescriptive note, pose a challenge. But let's understand what this threat actually means to our people. How does the civilization end? I say for all the people, and I get a lot of people saying, you know, we're the Jews are the ever-dying people. There have been people like you in every generation predicting our end, and look, we're still here. That's all true, and I could be wrong for sure. However, I don't think there's ever been a civilization that predicted its demise. If we go back to the Phoenicians, there was no Phoenician who wrote 50 years before the end of the Phoenicians. We've got about 50 years left. And yet every civilization does have a beginning and an end. I don't think there are any exceptions other than the ones that are currently alive, but there are 10,000 that rose and fell before us. I'd be very careful with the assumption that because we've been here for a long time, we automatically get to stay here forever. I don't think that's a wise assumption to make. In this country, we're not asking the question, should there be Jews, which is the title of the first section of the book. And I think that's a question that we need to start with. And it's an honest question. Honest meaning I'm willing to entertain a negative answer to that question. Yeah, maybe there shouldn't be Jews in the world. And there are a number of people in these book talks, actually more in Israel than in the United States, who answer in the negative. Said if we're not talking about gas chambers, we're just talking about melding into a bigger society. It'd be great if there were no Jews in 100 years. And I understand that, and I respect the answer. I feel differently, partially just in my kishkis, which is something I can't communicate to my children. It's my own personal thing, and I do have maybe a more cerebral answer to why it's a good thing that there be Jews in the world. But we should start with that question, and each of us decide where we stand on that. Because the next question that arises for anybody who has any sense of responsibility or communal responsibility is, what's my role in perpetuating the future of this people? And while I see intermarriage as kind of a non-event, again, as I said, for my family, there is no real divide between the Jews and the non-Jews in my family. It really doesn't matter on an individual or family level. We do need to recognize that the way we manage intermarriage today, almost none of the grandchildren of intermarried couples are Jewish. They might be halachically Jewish, but they don't identify as Jewish, meaning it is an end to a 4,000-year chain when we do that in most cases. And if we continue doing it at the rate that we're doing it today, we have 2 generations left. That's just the math. 2 generations. Read the book. I go through it. I don't want to bore you guys with it, but it's pretty simple math. It does make a few assumptions. One is that trends are linear, which is never the case. Trends are never linear. That said, that doesn't mean they're cyclical. They could be exponential. And I would argue today that the number of cities in this country where a Jew of marrying age has a statistically likely chance of meeting another Jew of marrying age in the opposite sex is going down every few years, right? There used to be 50 cities where that was the case. Now there may be 30 cities where that's the case. In my children's generation, there'll be maybe 10 cities where that's the case. In my grandchildren's generation, it might be New York, maybe. Maybe. So we are dying out here if we continue on this path. In Israel, unfortunately, I have worse news. In that the chapter on American Jewry is called Dying in Our Sleep. It's the best way to die. If we're going to die, let's do it like this. It's just love, right? We're meeting wonderful people who happen not to be Jewish. And again, there's no tragedy there on the individual level. It's just a communal tragedy. I will pause for a second and talk, because I'd love to revisit this if anybody's interested in it, and just talk about Judaism as an exercise in navigating tensions, right? The Talmud is all about competing imperatives. One of the central tensions in Judaism is between the individual and the community. And if we kind of go back, maybe I should have started with this. Let's go back to the Exodus, which is our defining event. We become an we become a nation in the Exodus, and we're granted our two great gifts, right? The Torah and the land of Israel. I think it's 603,000 male Jews that depart Egypt, if I remember correctly. All of them die. All of them die in the wilderness under terrible conditions. Remember, immediately after leaving Egypt, we start complaining to Moses, and we tell him it was better in Egypt. I wasn't there, so I'm not going to disagree. It must have been really terrible in the desert. And then everybody dies, miserable, suffering in the desert. Only 2 people who left Egypt also entered the Promised Land, not even Moses. So on the individual level, this defining gift of Judaism is just a tragedy. It's not a gift at all. The only way we can receive that gift is in community, which I think highlights this tension, which will always be with us today. And when I say we're peak Jew in 2019, that's on the individual level, right? On the community, I think this might be the weakest we've been, certainly in a very long time. That's the United States. In Israel, the intermarriage meter for kind of the health, or maybe we shouldn't even call it health, the attractiveness. It's a good proxy for the attractiveness of Judaism. To what extent do I want Judaism to be a part of my life? In Israel, that's obscured because we only meet Jews. We don't know anybody who's not Jewish, so that's who we marry. Increasingly, our identities in Israel are not really Jewish identities. They're Israeli identities, particularly our community, which I call in the book the secularists in Israel, who by and large describe themselves as Israelis, whose big aspiration in life is normalcy. We want to be like any other country. Turns out that's not a good aspiration. It doesn't work. We're not going to be normal. And if you want to be normal, go to California. It's much easier to be normal in California. I argue in the book that there's been a governance mechanism in place for the Jews for the last 1,800 years. It's a derivative of the statistics of the wisdom of crowds. I don't know if people are familiar with it, but we can circle back. And again, I don't want to get into it now, but if anyone wants to ask about it, I'm happy to describe what I saw, what I see as the mechanism of Jewish governance. We are losing it in this country, and we're losing it in Israel for different reasons. This is the mechanism that we've used to adjudicate our disputes, our communal disputes, our halachic disputes, and to guide ourselves to make our big decisions or our big definitions. This is how we decided whether legumes are kosher for Passover or not kosher for Passover, or much bigger questions like who is a Jew. A modern question that wasn't around for most of that period in diaspora is, what do we mean when we say nation state of the Jewish people? Right? We came to our ancestral homeland and recreated the nation state of the Jews. What exactly does that mean? So I argue that there have been three animating visions for defining nation state of the Jews in Israel. And we never reconciled those visions. In diaspora, we would have been forced to reconcile those visions, and we would have done it in a way that's not hierarchical. We'd have to duke it out across the table, arguing, which is what we do. Briefly, those visions I call the secularist vision, and these are my definitions, so it's, you know, that you can feel free to challenge them. The secularist vision for Jewish statehood is a refuge for Jewish people, structured as a democracy. That's about it. That was Herzl's vision for Israel. We can tack on some trappings of Jewishness, kind of a Chad Ha'am style. Our national holidays will be Jewish holidays, but we're not going to have the government dictate religiosity to the citizenry. Right? That's really our whole ambition: democracy for Jewish people. There is a theocratic vision, which at the time of Israel's establishment in 1948 had very few adherents, and those adherents had very limited political aspirations. Today, they're about 1 million. They're growing at close to 7 per family. So you understand that each generation is 3.5 times the size of the last generation, not 1 times the size of the last generation, or not twice. And they have maximalist political ambitions to dictate one version of Jewish religiosity to an entire Jewish population, and in the country that claims to speak for Jewry globally. The third has very few adherents today, but they're very relevant, I think, for the next 5 years, and either they kill us in the next 5 years or fade into irrelevance, and I call that the territorialist vision. That if you create a hierarchy or totem pole of values that we're pursuing as the Jewish state, they would put the entire land of Israel ahead of democracy, maybe even ahead of Jewish sovereignty. This is a constituency that feels that there is no human prerogative to relinquish a divine gift, which is the land of Israel. I think that group has about 200,000 adherents at most. It's not everybody who lives in Judea and Samaria. Again, I think they fade into irrelevance if we manage to get past the next 5 years and still have our hand on the lever of what we look like on a map, because we're going to lose it ultimately. Those are the three visions. There's a fourth constituency, which I call the fourth Israel, which doesn't have a vision. And that's largely people that we have boxed out of this discussion by pushing them to parts of the country where they're educationally starved, economically starved. They don't have the bandwidth to engage in this conversation. They do vote, but not on the basis of a discussion like this. In 1947, David Ben-Gurion signed what's called the Status Quo Agreement. This is pre-state, where we decided that instead of trying to reconcile these visions and come up with a constitution that says, all right, lowest common denominator, this is what most of us agree, this is what we're doing here. This is what we mean when we say a nation state of the Jews. Instead, the Status Quo Agreement segregated the adherents of these three visions into distinct communities. So we live geographically in geographically segregated communities. We don't know each other. I don't meet ultra-Orthodox Jews on a day-to-day basis in Israel. If I want to meet them, I have to seek them out. There's nowhere I would go where I would encounter somebody from the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel. Same with the territorialists. We have separate education systems, totally different curriculum. We study different things. The very rights and obligations of citizenship are different. We're not living in the same country. We're not living in the same country, right? We might be physically sitting within the same borders, but we're not citizens of the same country. That worked for a long time. It's blowing up right now. It worked because Israel was a refuge, and that was enough. That was enough of a definition, because there were Jews in trouble somewhere in the world for the last 70 years, right? And we absorbed them. We absorbed them unquestioningly, and to me, it's beautiful. We're a family. I kind of think, and in the book I interviewed members of other diasporas, like the Chinese diaspora, which actually kind of looks like ours if you look at it on a map of the world. There are more, but the distribution is actually pretty similar and a lot of actually similar attributes. I didn't find an example in any other diaspora of what this community did on behalf, for example, of Soviet Jewry in the 1970s and 1980s, people we had never met before, people from whom we were separated by at least 2 or 3 generations. Or the fact that Israel, when I moved to Israel, I moved together with almost 1.5 million new immigrants from the former Soviet Union. They came in over an 18-month period. The population of Israel was 4.25 million when these people came in. We absorbed a quarter of our population in a year and a half. We threw the pension system into immediate default, crushing to the economy. There are no protests. You're coming home. This is your home, your family. It's beautiful. To me, it's beautiful. There are no Jews in trouble today. And I say that with some humility. I understand that at the fringes there are a couple exceptions. There's the Persian Jewish community. I don't know if it's 10,000 or 15,000 people. If we get them out, then we can say there are really no Jews in trouble. Every Jew in the world is living exactly where he or she wants to live. I don't care if you're in Marseille or in Berlin. You can get up and go if you don't want to be there. Everybody has the option to do that. And by and large, they're not exercising that option, but I think they ultimately probably will. But in any case, there's nobody in trouble. So we actually have to face the question now, for the first time since independence in Israel. What do we mean when we say nation state of the Jews? It's not just a refuge now. It's not. American Jewry does not need a refuge. And here's where those competing visions are beginning to clash. And I think the way we see Israel going today, and this is my big concern or fear for Israel, is we need to be strong militarily if we're going to survive in the Middle East. There's just no other option. And I say this as a lefty peacenik in Israel, but not an idiot. I've been there. I've been in battle for 18 years. I understand the other side, and this is not hyperbole. The other side has genocidal intentions. Are they shared universally by every citizen on the other side? No, they're not. De facto, when it comes to meeting us on the battlefield and off the battlefield, the intentions are genocidal. Our neighbors, including the neighbors that we have formal peace agreements with, have never reconciled themselves with the notion of Jewish sovereignty. And if you look at the rest of the Middle East, one of the things you will notice is that there are no Jews. There are no Jews. We have been ethnically cleansed from 100% of the Middle East. The Baghdadi Jewish community is 1,000 years older than Islam itself. It has 0 members. I read that there's one guy, but I don't know if that's true. The Damascus Jewish community, the Aleppo Jewish community, the Cairo Jewish community, there are no Jews in the Middle East. The only place where you can be Jewish and alive in the Middle East is under Jewish sovereignty. This is how our enemies see us, and I think it's important that we understand that. That doesn't mean we don't try to make peace. That doesn't mean we don't take risks for peace. I think we should. But let's also do it with our eyes wide open. In order to be strong militarily, we need to be strong economically. Right? And Israel is a recipient of U.S. defense aid. It covers about 9% of the defense budget in Israel. Right? The other 91% is covered by the Israeli taxpayers. And when you look at the Israeli taxpayers, about 20% of the tax base in Israel is fiscally accretive to the Israeli economy. Right? They pay in more than they take out in shekels. About 80% takes out more than it puts in. Just like the United States, just like pretty much every capitalist democracy. That 80-20 rule holds economically pretty much everywhere. What's special about Israel is that 20% is all secularists. That's who's paying the taxes in Israel. All secularists. Yeah. By the way, and to be clear, it's my definition. Secularist means somebody who wants a refuge for the Jewish people structured as a democracy. He might wear a kippah, or she might wear a kippah. They might even live in Efrat, in Judea. But if we vote that we're leaving Efrat, they're packing up and leaving. That's a secularist. The secularists also send their kids to fight our wars. The territorialists also send their kids to fight. And to be clear, I think I made myself clear where I think the territorialists are taking us. They are the best people we have in the military today, the best. If you're in a foxhole with somebody, you want to be there with a territorialist. The most self-deprecating, humble, self-sacrificing segment of the Israeli population is these people. They are wonderful. Their ideology is suicidal. The people are wonderful, in my view. But the territorialists are a huge fiscal drain. There's very little that's produced in their communities, very little of economic value that's produced in their communities. And their defense and just their infrastructure costs us billions every year. The theocrats contribute to neither of those twin burdens of survival in the Middle East. They don't send their kids to fight the wars. You know, there are a few green shoots, but by and large, they don't send their kids to fight the wars, and they don't pay any taxes. Quite the opposite. We subsidize their study stipends for life. The fourth Israel, it's uncomfortable to say, but we have to be looking at reality. The fourth Israel is a wash. This is not the startup nation export economy that's been driving Israeli economic growth for the last 20 years. It's the local economy. And I devote a few pages to it. If you're interested in understanding why I feel this way, please have a read. I don't want to judge any of these visions on its merit. I don't think any of them really work. Right? I don't think my secularist vision has been adequate. Normalcy is not an appropriate ambition for the nation state of the Jews. We're never going to achieve it. I don't want to achieve it anymore. I don't think that should be our ambition. So this is not about judging anybody. But we do have to understand that the twin burdens of just physical survival in the Middle East are borne by the secularists. And gradually, without any demographer cataloging it, but if there are Israelis in the room, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Gradually, they are leaving. They're coming here. And there is a vicious selection bias here, is that the people who we need the most are the people who are the best candidates for leaving. They're the people who get the automatic genius visas to come to the United States and to do a PhD at Stanford, or to run a hedge fund, or to run a startup a company in Silicon Valley. Historically, there's been a revolving door. And again, Israel, if you can afford it, is a great, Zionism aside, if you can afford it, Israel is an incredible place to live. I don't think there's anything like it. I've never encountered anything like it. Again, put Judaism and Zionism aside, culture and food and weather and even professional opportunities, there's nothing like it. It's fantastic. But increasingly, we're seeing people saying, I don't want to take that deal. So I'm going to tell just a quick story. Do we have a... Am I okay on time? Yeah. So about half my squadron lives outside of Israel. Half the kibbutzniks who taught me how to be an Israeli, the people that I mimicked in accent and imitated in manner in order to play that role of the Israeli fighter pilot. It's not me. It was an act, right? Yeah, when the rubber hit the road on the technicals, I had to do the same thing everyone else did. But how do you behave? How do you hold a cigarette? This was me copying. Half these guys are outside of Israel. One is a very acclaimed neurosurgeon in Australia. One runs a company in Seoul, Korea. One's son just graduated university in Beijing. He runs a venture capital firm in Beijing. Two of them run startups, or no longer startups, big technology companies in California. Two of them are in New York. One runs a hedge fund. One's an investment banker. Two of them are in London. That's my squadron. I recently had dinner with a friend who lives in California, a friend from the squadron, who said the following, and this is something that I think we should all be worried about. I think we should all be thinking about this. Kibbutznik, his wife's a kibbutznik. She was an officer in an intelligence unit in the Israeli army. He was a pilot with me in the Air Force. They both went to the Technion. That's where they met. So they are Israel's MIT. He started a company, sold it to a company in California, made a lot of money, and had to go live in California for 2 years and run this as a division of the company for 2 years. Those 2 years just ended. He happened to be in New York. We got together for dinner with his wife as well. And I asked innocently, this was not about the book, and their answer is not new. I've heard this many times, but I think it really puts a point on it. I asked them, what's your next move? You don't want to stay at the company. Are you going back to Israel? So she stopped me and said, we're never going back to Israel. We're never going back to Israel. They have 4 kids. She said, I'll do everything in my power to keep my kids from going back and serving. I said, okay, so coming from somebody like that, we need to understand what's going on here. And I asked. We don't say theocracy among the secularists in Israel. We call it Medinat Ayatolot, an Ayatollah nation. That's what we mean, though. I will not countenance a scratch on my boy's head in defense of the Ayatollah nation that we will be by the time he's drafted. He's 6 years old now. Number one. Number two, our neighbors in Los Altos are also Jewish. The dividing line in our faiths happened 2 generations ago in Poland, where one set of grandparents got on a boat for America, another set got on a boat for Palestine. That does not have to dictate the fact that his kid gets to go to Stanford while mine has to sit at a checkpoint and get shot at for 3 years. I don't want that deal. I don't have to take that deal. I have a green card. I'm going to have citizenship. That's behind me. I understand her. Of course, how could you not understand her? But we should all be alarmed when you hear that kind of thing. And it's not one person, it's not one family that's saying it. But what he said is very much the heart of the matter. She's talking about symptoms. This is the disease. Is despite everything that she said, they send their kids to a Hebrew program, a Hebrew after-school program, I think at a JCC there. It's important that they speak Hebrew for some reason. He was invited to a Parents' Day at this program, and he was telling me how he was sitting across the table from an American Jewish father and thinking to himself, you know, it's fine, I'm looking at this man and I feel no kinship for him. I really don't care what happens to him. Our fates are not at all linked. I have nothing against him, but definitely nothing for him either. And at the same time, I'm thinking to myself, isn't it funny that I would die for Ismail? Ismail is a Druze weapon systems operator in the squadron. But for this Jewish man, nothing. So I'm thinking to myself, that's not funny at all. And to be clear, I feel the same way about Ismail. This is somebody who's linked his fate to ours. He's a brother. He would do it for me, I would do it for him, and I love him. But the fact that we have raised now successive generations of Israeli Jews who feel no kinship, no affinity to world Jewry strikes me as a fundamental failure of Zionism. It's a correctable failure. We can do something about it. But if we don't, this is what I see happening, is we will cross a threshold after which Israel becomes unviable, militarily, unviable. There's a critical mass of defenders and funders that we need. And when we go below that critical mass, we become unviable. And there's going to be no sign in the road that says, this is the point. We're not going to recognize it. If we're lucky, we'll recognize it in retrospect. We're certainly not going to recognize it in advance. I don't know where we are relative to that point. I still think we're pretty far from it. When I wrote the book, I thought this was something my grandchildren might have to deal with. Today, I think it's something I'm going to see, if we don't change course. That's the bad news. The good news is it's the same disease. It's the same disease. The Israeli symptoms look a little different from the American symptoms, but it is the same disease, and it has the same cure. That cure is a redefinition of what this whole enterprise is, Judaism. What are we doing? What exactly is this for? Israel only has viability, moral viability, and practical viability if we see it as an asset of the Jewish people. We can't see Israel as an end. It's a means. I think a critical means. I'm as fervent a Zionist as I've ever been. But let's understand that it's not an end. It's a means. The Jewish people has to be the end. Our challenge is to put forward a definition of Judaism that is compelling enough that a critical mass of young Jews embrace it and say, this is something I want. I want to buy into this. And we can add to that critical mass people who are not born Jewish, but who say, I want in. I want in. But if my sister, one of my sisters-in-law, were to ask my brother, hey, look, I've been thinking about converting after all these years. Tell me what it is. What's this all about? He wouldn't have an answer. He had no answer. We don't know what we're talking about. We don't know what this is. So I'm gonna end with a little story, and then I'd love to hear people's reactions. This is a story from this book tour. So speaking to groups like this, I've been approached now a few times by grandmothers at the end of book talks. And it seemed just like a cute story the first 2 or 3 times I heard it. After the 5th or 6th time, I realized, okay, there's something happening here, and I have to pay attention. So it's an amalgam, but this is more or less the story. I'm not an Orthodox Jew, but all of my grandchildren are Jewish. So I've totally bucked the statistics of the Pew Survey of 2013, and everything that you're talking about is alarming hasn't applied to me. My husband converted. Had I married a born Jew, I'm almost sure this would not have been the outcome. Okay, wow. So what's going on here? So there's a section in the book where I talk about conversion, and I think I get the quantitative piece of this right. I miss the qualitative point, which is much more important. So the book has a lot of kind of interplays between Judaism and Americanism, because I really do think that the architecture of this country, culturally, legally, in so many ways, is fundamentally Jewish. Why not borrow a few things back from Americanism? So this is just one proposal for dealing with conversion. It's not the only one, but it is mine. So I look at immigration and naturalization in this country. If you're born on U.S. soil or born to an American parent, you're an American. That's the law. You don't have to know anything about what makes this country what it is. You don't have to make any commitments. There's no pledge, there's no oath, there's nothing that you're required to do in order to remain an American. That is your gift for life. If you wish to become an American, though, you're not American and you wish to become an American, you have to clear 2 bars. One is a knowledge bar. You've got to pass a citizenship test in English. We could argue about whether the test is hard enough or too hard. That really doesn't matter. The point is that there is a bar. You've got to know something about what makes this country what it is in order to gain citizenship. And you have to clear a hurdle of commitment. You need to make a commitment to this people if you're going to become one of them. So first you need to live among us for 5 years just to be eligible. You need to study for that test, which is in itself for many people a pretty big commitment. And then ultimately, you need to take an oath of allegiance as a condition of your citizenship. You don't get it without taking that oath. I never had to take that oath. The immigrant American does. So is it a stretch to argue that by virtue of having to clear these 2 hurdles, one of knowledge, one of commitment, that the average immigrant American is a better American than the average born American? I'm talking average. There are definitely exceptions on both sides. I acknowledge that. I don't think that's a stretch at all. And surveys will tell you it's definitely a more grateful American. How do you measure good American? That's already subjective. But it's certainly a more grateful American. I think the same calculus holds for Judaism, is that we're facing a crisis of knowledge. Most Jews in the world today, both in Israel and the United States, grow up with very limited knowledge of our legacy. That's how I grew up. That's how most of us grow up. And we make no real commitment to Judaism. Now, what would a commitment look like? We can talk about later, or we can read in the prescriptions of the book. Somebody who chooses to join us is doing both of those things. And by virtue of having asked the question, I married this man, and we decided together we're going to raise a Jewish family. He's going to be Jewish, and the children are going to be Jewish. However, whatever form that takes, and I do think it has to take a uniform form, which we can discuss if people are interested, but whatever form it takes today, that required these 2 people to sit down and define, what does Judaism mean? What does that mean? What does it mean prescriptively for our children? Just by virtue of having asked that question, I think we're 80% of the way there. And the challenge of this book, and what I'm trying to do through this book, is to get most of us, I'm never going to get all of us, I understand that, but to get most of us to just ask that question. What is Judaism? How do we want to define it going forward? I'm not going to get into it. I propose a very specific mechanism for defining it. I don't propose a definition because I don't think one person should be doing that. I think that this is a communal effort. But that is the ultimate question, I think, for everybody who wants there to be a Jewish future, is how do we define Judaism? I'm going to stop there and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Tal, and I can tell you that in this beautifully, beautifully written book, it explores the different problems and questions involving the Jewish society, both in this country and in Israel, and you've done that so well now, but we are going to hit you up shortly for the good news and the prescriptive ideas that you really provocatively and uniquely describe toward the end of the book. And Tal can also tell us about some of the reaction to the book, which has some very hopeful possibilities ahead. But as we always do here at this moment, as you formulate your questions, I'm going to take 1 second to just tell you what our upcoming program is. Our next lecture will be on Sunday, April 28th at 10:30 a.m. We'll focus on the late Nobel laureate, author, activist Elie Wiesel, who himself spoke in the Scholar Series not so many years ago. 2 former associates will share their reminiscences. We'll hear from Rabbi Ariel Berger, Wiesel's former teaching assistant at Boston University, and from Nadine Epstein, the editor-in-chief of Moment magazine, which Wiesel helped found in 1975. With a multimedia presentation, Nadine will share interviews and reflections from Wiesel's friends, colleagues, and family, among them his son Elisha, Ben Kingsley, Itzhak Perlman, Oprah Winfrey, Ted Koppel, and many others. Unfortunately, our scheduled speaker for May 15th, Sally Cohn, had to cancel for personal reasons, so please check our website and Temple Communications for an update. Now we'll have a microphone going around for your questions, and I'll just kick it off by asking Tal for that upbeat ending that you promised us about what you think we can do to stem the dire fate that you see ahead in terms of diminishing numbers of Jews worldwide and relevance of Judaism going forward, because we clearly have to do something. Your economic tally is a frightening one. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, so the question is, what's the prescription? I'm going to give it on a very, very high level, and I urge you read it, challenge it. There's a website where we're culling different people's input, because what I put forward should not be the final result. 3 layers. One is make use of the massive leaps forward we've taken in technology in the last 20 years, particularly in Israel, to create something that I call a virtual diaspora, which is really a crowd wisdom engine that culls the inputs of Jews from around the world into questions that define Judaism. Again, small questions like the legumes, big questions like what does nation state of the Jews mean? It's an online platform. It's under development now. It's not ready today, but we'll essentially use the science of crowd wisdom to cull our collective answer to these questions. I'll make a distinction. It's not democracy. It's much more like a market. Okay, it's like a market trying to find the price, the true price of a stock or a bond or something like that. It's different from democracy, and I describe the differences in the book. The second layer is financial. It's an educational endowment for Jews, which is getting its kickstart from some of the big Jewish philanthropies today, but ultimately will have anybody who wants to participate paying in, because I think it's important that we all have skin in the game. When I talk about commitment, that's what I mean. And it's a percentage, right? It's not a dollar amount, but a percentage amount of your pre-tax income that goes into this. But essentially three formal outputs that you get from participating in this endowment, and then there's a bunch of informal stuff which might be more important. Very briefly, two summer camp programs, one in Israel, one in the United States. Americans, Israelis, and the rest of diaspora together in these summer camps, getting to know each other, because I think one of the issues that we have today is we don't know each other. We don't understand each other's realities, and it's very easy to become dismissive of each other's concerns when we don't know each other's realities, and we don't understand, we're not connecting heart to heart with each other. But also a pretty formal curriculum of just giving people a very broad brushstroke taste of our legacy. This is what you're inheriting. Decide what to do with it. If you decide it's not important to you, that's okay. And we shouldn't be shooting for 100%. What I think we want to be trying to avoid is people who, like me, were probably on a trajectory to dispense with that legacy without even questioning it, without even realizing that that's what we were doing. If you know what you're doing and you want to step away from it, great. A summer after high school, which is a kind of I call it a tikkun program, where you're doing something for a larger community. It doesn't have to be within the Jewish world, but somewhere in the world. Again, the architecture is scripted. It's a business plan, so if you read it, you'll see it gets quite specific on that point. And then the third piece, which is the bait and switch, which people don't all like, but I understand it, is your undergraduate tuition is paid for, no matter where you go to school. The numbers work. You can go through the financial model. It's available online. You can challenge the assumptions. I think they're pretty conservative assumptions. It's something that we can actually pay for if people start paying into this program early. Couldn't figure out how to make Jewish day school work for everybody. That was beyond my capabilities, but undergraduate tuition we can. And I say bait and switch because, right, people rightly say, well, what's Jewish about that? You know, everybody wants a college tuition. The people that we need to buy into this program are by and large not interested in becoming more Jewish. That's not the point. The hope is that over the life of this program, a certain percentage of those people will say, you know what, I started this for the college tuition, which is something that most of us worry about. But over time and through the exposure to this community, I'm realizing there's something much bigger here. And then the third piece, which is popular in the United States and very unpopular in Israel, as you can understand, essentially says, look, we have this national, when I say national, I don't mean Israeli, I mean Jewish. The Jewish nation has an asset. It's the nation state of the Jewish people, an asset that we haven't had in a long time. A lot of us here in this country are not looking at it as an asset. I think in some cases for very justifiable and understandable reasons. In some cases, I think for the wrong reasons. I think, to be clear, if you spoke to my father when he was alive, he was an adult before 1948 and after 1948. The fact that we can walk with our back straight in this country has a lot to do with the fact that we do have a plan B. The fact that Jews can be proud around the world and have ascended to the heights that we've ascended really in the last 2 generations has a lot to do with the fact that we all have a plan B. It is all of our asset. But there are 2 distinct missions in Israeli statehood. One is that we need to run a state just like any other state. Okay, Switzerland, Belgium, China, it doesn't matter. Everybody needs fiscal policy, healthcare policy, education policy. We have a second mission, which is we are the self-proclaimed nation state of the Jews, meaning we belong to people who are not citizens in this country. We need to stop obfuscating. For 70 years, it's been unclear where one mission ends and the other begins. Let's separate the 2 and be very clear about what that is. We have a government today in Israel that works. We can complain about how it works, but we do that in the United States as well. That's fine. It is taking care of the first mission, right? We do have healthcare policy, we have infrastructure policy, we have education policy. That's working in Israel. In what makes us the nation state of the Jews, I propose that we take an office that currently exists. It has its own bureaucracy and infrastructure. It's the presidency of Israel. It doesn't have a real function. It's really a ceremonial function. And we endow that office with real teeth, real sovereign teeth, both legislative and executive, to run the nation state of the Jewish people. That is the office that should be charged with defining who is a Jew for purposes of full citizenship in Israel, not the law of return. What we have today, the law of return is really asylum. It's not exactly citizenship, right? The law of return is drafted directly from the Nuremberg laws, which says if you were Jewish enough for the Nazis, you're Jewish enough for us, meaning one Jewish grandparent. But if it's the wrong Jewish grandparent, then you don't have the full rights of citizenship in this country. If you're not recognized by two men as Jewish, you can't marry another Jew in this country. You can't be buried in a Jewish cemetery. You could have gone to war for us and died for us. You were Jewish enough for that, but you're not Jewish enough to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. If you can't marry, you can't file taxes jointly. So there are actual fiscal implications to not being recognized by these two men as Jewish. I'm not arguing with their rulings. Their rulings are all over the place, and I'm not sure there's much to argue with there anyway. I'm arguing with the mechanism. That cannot be the mechanism for determining who is a Jew, especially as we're extending rights. We all, or if you're Jewish, you have the right to immigrate to Israel and become a citizen under the law of return. We're extending rights to people who are not our citizens currently. Those people need some tool to defend those rights, which they can't today. Custody of the holy sites of Judaism, just Judaism, not Islam and not Christianity. There's a religious affairs ministry that does that. That's part of being a regular country. Judaism, though, is different. Who has access to the wall? Who has access to the tomb of Abraham and Sarah in Hebron, if we're going to still be there? This is not a question for the elected government of Israel. This is a question for all Jews, if we are going to be the nation state of all Jews. And the third and last component is what are the obligations of the nation state of the Jews to the Jewish diaspora? It has obligations, and we recognize them. Right? The Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency's biggest division, deals with Jews outside of Israel, right? Spiriting Jews out of Ethiopia through Sudan, missions that I took part in for many years. Getting Jews out of the Soviet Union many years ago. Providing training for security guards in French Jewish schools and synagogues today. But who decides who gets those resources? Did the French Jewish community collectively say, yes, we want you to train these security guards? Did the British Jewish community say, yes, take resources away from us and give them to the French? There is no one has a voice. No Jew outside of Israel has a voice in how that's administered. So the proposal is we take the presidency and make it the presidency of the nation state of the Jews, elected by all Jews everywhere in the world. Any Jew in the world should be eligible to run for that office. It is an office that will claim some sort of jurisdiction, or Jewishly claim some sort of jurisdiction over all Jews, and will have no jurisdiction over Israeli non-Jews, and therefore should not be elected by Israeli non-Jews. If you're Muslim in Israel, this office has no authority over you. So that's the prescription in a nutshell. Should we open it up to questions?
Do we have another mic, or should? Okay. So, Dan will walk around with a mic.
Or do you want another one? Or you just speak here?
Well,
Just stand up.
yeah, okay. Whichever you prefer.
Very much enjoyed your remarks. Having a son who's made Aliyah, who went to medical school in Israel, is in the Israeli army. He's flying to Israel today. Half his unit has been called up. He's in the States for a trauma fellowship, and he's done in another form what you have done. What is concerning to me, and I was wondering if you were Prime Minister of Israel today, or if you were in a position, you spoke about the Ayatollah nation, the 6 or 7 children, the statistics of what is going to happen, paying no taxes, no responsibility to defend the nation. To me, Israel, one of the most serious things that Israel has to deal with is how can you change that? Can it be changed? What would you do if you were in a position to say, we're going to do this tomorrow?
Right.
Good question. Thank you.
So I don't want to get to specific policies because I think there's 100 of them. There's no silver bullet solution here. But I think it all has to start with this definition of a lowest common denominator definition of Judaism. What exactly is it that we are buying into here? Be clear, I don't think we need these people in the army. That's all right. They should be doing some sort of service, though, to the people, right? By the way, the army's too big. We don't need all these people, and it's also changing the character of the army, right? I think the Israeli army was probably the most friendly to women of any Western army until very recently, until we had to start enacting all sorts of regulations to accommodate ultra-Orthodoxy within our ranks, and there are a lot of unintended consequences there, I'm sure. So I don't think that's something we want to fiddle with, but national service, yes, and then some accommodation for living a life, just like in this country, or anywhere. If you want to be an ultra-Orthodox Jew, that's great, but if you want to eat, you've got to work. That's, we can't be shouldering that burden. The threshold that I think is worth looking at today is that 50% of Israeli first graders today, and we're crossing that threshold right now, 50% of Israeli first graders will not be receiving draft papers in 7 years. Okay, that's an important threshold. Does that mean we collapse at 50%? I don't think so. Can we get to 30% who are carrying that burden and 70% not? I don't think so. And where we cross the threshold between those 2 points is unclear. But here's the good news: is that, from my perspective, the book has ultra-Orthodox readers, which surprises me. I never thought that would happen, and I speak to some of them, which has been enlightening and exciting. And while we obviously don't agree on a lot of things, that's fine. We do agree on the basic questions, and we understand that what we have going right now is not sustainable. We need to make some changes. And that's exciting. So I do see some real green shoots and people actually willing to engage.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really look forward to reading your book. And I do want to participate in some of these, your prescriptions, and certainly can do so financially. My question is, we have in this country, say 20 to 40-year-olds, and people are having children later. So 40-year-olds are having children now. They're 5 years old. 20-something, they're just graduating from college. Is there a way to attract them to Judaism? Because I guess that's where I'm at in my life,
Right.
who to attract that age group.
Right. So you're touching on a very sore point, which this book has resonated with an older readership, and it's true. It's people kind of my age, maybe a little younger than I am, and up. That's kind of been I'm trying very hard to get to people in their 20s and 30s. Had I known what I know now, I might have chosen a different medium. I think book might not have been the best way to reach people in their 20s and 30s. And my publisher showed me from the beginning, this my generation read close to 9 books a year on average, unassigned books a year, and the current generation reads just over 1. So it's not like reading's been decimated. Reading in book form has been decimated. Is it going to make a comeback? I don't know, but if to hope that this book is going to be the one that generation chooses to read is probably not realistic. We're looking at television and a few other media to try to pull people in with it's got to be a bait and switch. And I understand purists who say that's not Jewish. I know, I understand that. But we're not going to get people sitting down and having the conversation if we don't start with something that is interesting to them.
Here we go. Here we come.
Hi, I'm born in Jerusalem. I married an American, so I came to this country. This is very pessimistic. I have 2 grandchildren who are serving in the army, not at checkpoints. One is with his Arabic in intelligence, and one is with his cyber in intelligence. So I'm lucky in that respect. But over the centuries, common Jewish history, common experiences were always the common things among us, not just religion. There were people who were not religious, including my mother, who went to a Christian school in Germany, and luckily for her, she was kicked out by Hitler at the end of 1933. Many people around the world, not just Jews, leave for better opportunities. I agree that Israelis have another military and other problems, but I think it's very pessimistic. Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to start with one thing you said, which I agree with, religion. So when I do speak to young people, both here and in Israel, and ask the question, do you see Judaism playing a role in your life? If so, what role? A lot of people answer, well, I don't believe in God, so that's not a relevant question. Belief has never been a threshold requirement in Judaism. I can argue that Maimonides didn't believe in God either, and we're certainly not kicking him out of the canon. in this country, and I think this is something we imported from Europe, we have a very Christian notion of Judaism. We use the words religion and faith almost interchangeably in the United States. That works really well for Christianity, where belief is the central mitzvah, right, of Christianity, above everything else. In Judaism, it's unclear to me whether the first commandment really is a commandment to believe. I'm not sure that and that's the closest we get. So it's sort of implied, but it's not essential. We care much more about what you do than what you believe in general in Judaism. So by using the term religion, I think we might sell ourselves a bit short. Yes, there is a religion, of course, and there's a theology behind Judaism. But you're getting to, I think, something that's more like peoplehood, right? A common language. When I ask people to define Judaism, here are two descriptions that I really love. One was family, right? And we are in many ways a family. We argue with each other constantly. That's the central attribute of Judaism, but we love each other fundamentally, and we'll go to great lengths for each other's welfare. And the second is operating system. There is a way that we parse questions. You know, if you think about, and this is getting to the value of Judaism to humanity, not just to the Jews. If you think of a concept like justice, and many others, but take a concept like justice. It's not a natural phenomenon. It's a human invention, and it could have been invented in many different ways. It has been invented in many different ways, right? Justice 100 years ago, if there was a global consensus around what justice is, it's significantly different from what it is today, and I assume 50 years from now it'll still be different. The fact that you have one tiny people that has been debating, not being issued edicts by a pope, but debating, all of the participants qualified to debate and parse in the most nuanced way the thousands of sub-questions that add up to a definition of justice. And the fact that we've been recording for well over 2,000 years, not just the consensus views, but the dissenting views on what that means, gives us a sense of the arc of the evolution of that definition, justice. And just as in this country, we look at a constitutional amendment. How does the Constitution get amended? Anyone can argue. If we're good at arguing, we get kicked up to a higher and higher court, and ultimately the Supreme Court will adjudicate over constitutional issues. They will record both consensus and dissenting views, and sometimes the dissent is much longer than the consensus view, and is afforded as much respect, just like in the Talmud, is afforded as much respect as the consensus view. But when we argue a new case, we look back at precedent and we trace the arc, the trajectory of the evolution of our sense of the First Amendment or anything else that we're arguing. So there's huge value in that. I would argue let's not dispense with that so soon. I mean, I'm sure we can get by without it. I'm not saying the world ends when Judaism ends, but I think there's tremendous value in that. And on the pessimism point, I hope you're right. I don't know that I'm not a prophet. I'm not saying this is, in the year 2050, it's over. I don't know. I really don't know. But I liken it to a missile shot, right? You're on the plane, there's a missile coming at you, your sensors are telling you that. You could sit here and equivocate and decide, is it going to hit me? Is it not going to hit? We don't know that it's going to hit us. We don't know. Could have a malfunction, could be out of its envelope. There are a lot of reasons it might not hit us. If it's in the air, we should think about taking some evasive action, especially if it's a win-win. If we're not giving up something huge in order to take that evasive action, we should probably take it. And I think that's the case for us today. I'm not saying let's tear down something that's valuable. Not at all.
I'm going to ask a question. What do you say to the second half of the world Jewry, which is based in the United States, when they find the government and the policies of the state of the Jews to be literally unpalatable?
Yeah. Right. So I think I'd separate that question into...
No, many Americans find the policies of Israel unpalatable.
Yeah, no, that's in surveys. That's true. So I'd parse that into two. There are two families of questions about Israeli policy, and it's exactly the way I delineated the. Right. Okay. So you've got the prime minister and you've got the president in our ideal world down the road. Everything that has to do with defining the nation state of the Jews, my hope would be that we all feel enough ownership to jump into the fray and try to change things. Now, the fact that today we don't have any legislative mechanism to do that is a problem. All we can do is advocate, and we should advocate. We should advocate. We should be in Israel. We should be at the wall. lobbying to open up the commingled prayer section. These are important things to be doing today, and we need to make our voices heard in Israel. I think that's quite critical. If we can actually construct a legislative body with real teeth in Israel, that's ideal. I think that's in the prescription. But that doesn't mean that until that point we should give up. This is our asset. And by the way, most Israelis would agree with that. They just can't connect the dots to actually ceding some legislative power to people who are not citizens of Israel. There's another area, which is the area of just running a state. And here I go back to the woman, the wife of my squadron mate, where we do have to realize that what she's highlighting is that there's been a deal in place between specifically American, not just diaspora Jewry, I'm saying specifically American Jewry and an Israeli Jewry. You write the checks, we send our kids to die. That's the deal. We have to recognize that there's a reality in Israel that touches us every single day, and you can't get away from it. When you look the enemy in the face, you understand something that you don't understand from Washington, D.C. And I encourage people to go and try to experience it, try to understand it. Go spend a week in Sderot when it's under rocket attack, and realize all the little implications of that, all the little implications that you can't plan a family lunch. That's just not something you can do in Sderot. It's small stuff, right? These are realities that I think it's important, and if we don't know each other, we're not going to understand them. I get that, but these are realities that we should all understand. And I say the same thing from the Israeli side. Most Israelis don't understand, in the most basic sense, that Judaism is not baked into their calendar in the United States, right? If you don't opt into it, it's just not part of your life. So it's very easy for an Israeli to say, hey, listen, I'm secular. The Judaism I don't practice is Orthodox Judaism, right? So, but I have this right. I can hang the plaque on my wall. I'm a secular Israeli. I've done my duty. Reform Judaism in the United States is some distortion or some aberration. I kind of get it. And of course, a lot of Israelis do feel that way. So I think on both sides, we have a lot to learn from each other, and it is worth kind of trying to peer into each other's realities and get that. Again, I think there is a legislative solution to this, and ultimately it has to take something. It doesn't have to be exactly in the form that I prescribe, but I think that's got to be part of the solution.
Well, we have maybe one more question over here, and then we'll have to. Good question.
Yeah. So the question is, what Israelis mean when they say Ayatollah state? Broadly, a theocracy, right? A country that's governed by, in our case, two men's interpretation of what Judaism should be, and it's a very fickle interpretation because there's no accountability.
Who are those two men?
So I'm sorry, the two chief rabbis of Israel, the Ashkenazi and the chief and the Sephardic chief rabbis of Israel, who today will decide, which rabbis' conversions are accepted by the state of Israel, which rabbis are not. There is no guidebook that they can point to. There's no accountability. When they say, and let's be clear, this is not a reform issue. Most of modern Orthodoxy in this country has been pushed outside beyond the pale, right? They are not first-class Jews as far as the two chief rabbis of Israel are concerned. So that's what I mean.
Actually, one of the couples who was married here on Tuesday night, the reason they had to be married in this country was because the mother of one of the partners was deaf, and the chief rabbi in Israel decided that her conversion to Judaism was insufficient because she couldn't hear the word of the law. So a lot of it is very questionable. I guess we have two more urgent questions. Are you up for two more urgent questions, if people don't mind? Okay.
Just quickly, have you delivered this presentation before American Orthodox audiences? And if so, how has it been received?
Yeah. So the answer is yes. I haven't spoken to an ultra-Orthodox audience. That's been more one-on-one meetings or kind of small group meetings, so not an audience like this. I would say, by and large, modern Orthodoxy in America is probably the warmest reception that I get, is that this is a community that understands the tension between particularism and universalism, which we all feel, to be clear. Even the ultra-Orthodox understand that. It's not, not something, they might come down on a different part of the spectrum, but they get that as well, and understand the need to accommodate. Because these are people who are living Jewishly, typically living a very consciously Jewish life, and are very attuned to these notions. Yes, there are some people who are more resistant to the idea of kind of a flexible Judaism. Some people are much more into it, but you know, in general, the answer is yes, and they've been quite friendly. In Israel as well.
Now, Tal will be signing books outside, and will be an opportunity to talk with him out there at the table. So we'll have one last question for Lisa Badish over here.
And it's a perfect segue.
Okay.
Would you explain the meaning of the title of the book, God is in the Crowd?
Yeah. Okay, so it's a title that I sometimes regret. The question is, why is the book called God is in the Crowd? It's a title I sometimes regret because I actually think the word God turns off some young readers, which I didn't think about at the time, but I think it is the case. And interestingly, it was really a nod to those young readers. That's why it went in there, which is back to that question: what role do you see Judaism playing in your life, and does God have to be in it? One of the things I try to propose is a notion of God that doesn't require faith, and is compatible with the notion of a revealed God, because I think there's real value in having a God. And I'm not a believer myself. I never have been. I'd like to be, but it just hasn't been a gift I've received in my life. But I do think that as a species, we are dispensing with God prematurely. And we should invent God if we don't believe in God. So the notion that I put forward very briefly is one that's based on the wisdom of crowds, which is how I feel that diaspora Jewish life was governed, which very basic, you've probably seen these contests where you've got to guess the number of jelly beans in a jar. I don't know if you've seen that. The kunst in that game is not figuring out who's the best guesser at the number of jelly beans, and there are people who are really good at that consistently, and there are people who are very bad at that consistently. The interesting thing in that game is if you have enough people participating in it, you just take a simple average of all their guesses, and it's usually closer to the real number of jelly beans than the best guess in the crowd. And that should shock us. Now, markets behave that way. This phenomenon, has been applied in all sorts of areas. But the upshot of all of it is that when we come together as a group, structured in a certain way, not every crowd is wise, but if you structure a crowd in a certain way, you can create an intelligence that is inaccessible to any individual participant. That's how markets behave all the time. There are things that the market calls that no participant in the market would have been able to call, and it's uncanny sometimes. So if you like, it's higher intelligence that does not require faith. And I think there are different crowds that have wisdom. We're not the only wise crowd out there, but we are a wise crowd. And if that's God enough for you, it's God enough for me. If it's God enough for you, then we're in the same game. Can we be in the same game with somebody who believes in a revealed God? I argue yes. And I've been thinking about in terms of, this is the last thing I'll say, is if you and I started a company that makes circles as a product, that's our product, is circles. Anybody can come in and order a circle from us, any size they want. They tell us the radius, we make the circle. We need a point, obviously. You need the radius and you need a point in order to define that circle. I could argue that it doesn't matter where we put the point. It could be on the floor or on the ceiling or in space. It doesn't matter. You're going to get exactly the same circle. You just need a point. We can invent it. You could argue that no, for the circle to be kosher, our point needs to be in the center of the eastern wall of our factory. We can still work together. We can still work together. We're just going to take your point. We're going to go over to your wall, and when you and I are working together, if I'm working with other people, I might put my points elsewhere. But when I'm working with you, I'm going to do that. That requires love, and that's why I think this notion of Judaism as a family is critical. We need to love each other in order to work that way, because let's be clear. I know that you think I am, what's the word? A heretic. Right? I'm a heretic because I think I could put these points anywhere. What does this guy But I know you love me, and it's okay that you think I'm a heretic. And you understand that I think you're crazy, right? But I still love you, right? And we're in the same family, and we're still doing this together. We're still making our circles together. I think the two can coexist, and I think they always have in Judaism. They always have. I don't know if this works for Christianity. I speak to Episcopal groups and Catholic groups also, which is always interesting to me, and I tried this on them. I don't feel it works as well in Christianity just because of the centrality of faith. But we get to cut ourselves some slack on the faith side, and so I think it actually works quite well for us. Long answer, that's why it's called God is in the Crowd.
Thank you so much. I hope you will read this really eloquent book and come meet Tal at the signing table. Thank you for coming.